When I was younger, I used to enjoy looking through video game strategy guides while at different stores. I'd always been drawn to good video game art, and flipping through the glossy pages of these books, especially the ones I hadn't played, always made me imagine what the games were like. I have a vivid memory of being drawn to the guidebook for the PS2 game Ratchet and Clank Up Your Arsenal. I was so entranced by the game's art and the designs for all of the different weapons that I just felt like I had to play the game. I ended up buying the guidebook despite not having the game or even a PlayStation 2 at the time, just because I wanted to continue looking through it. I would eventually get a PlayStation 2 the following year in order to play this game. As I got older, I got more involved in the Xbox ecosystem and was really focused on playing multiplayer games with my friends, leaving me to largely forget about PlayStation and the Ratchet and Clank series. Then, one summer while I was in high school, I was visiting and staying with my cousin for about a week. And while he was working during the weekday, I got a chance to play his PlayStation 3, which is a game system I hadn't really interacted with much up to this point. While looking through his game collection, I saw Ratchet and Clank: A Crack in Time among them. I immediately remembered enjoying the series on PlayStation 2 and decided to start this one up and see if they were still good games. This was the first game I ever really played on PlayStation 3, and over the course of that week, I completely beat the game, unlocked everything, found all of the collectibles, and even earned my cousin the Platinum Trophy for the game. And it ended up becoming one of the core reasons I would purchase a PlayStation 3, much like the PS2 before it. This in turn would lead me to playing through other great games in the Ratchet and Clank series, as well as the many other great PlayStation titles, and this ultimately turned me into mainly a PlayStation gamer. So I can't say that I've been there since the beginning, but regardless, Ratchet and Clank is a series that means a lot to me.
Oh dear.
Was that a kraken?
Or at least a very large octopus. Sorry.
Rift Apart is a good game, probably a great game for many. Its visuals are fantastic, and the large variety of planets allows for the showcasing of the graphics with many different environmental locations and styles. Some personal favorites include the snowy ocean planet and the labs beneath the surface, as well as a planet that's centered on a robotic pirate cove. They all look great. Additionally, the game's combat and overall movement systems are probably the best they have ever been, and they feel great the entire length of the game. The controls during combat feel natural, and it's never been easier to switch among and utilize all of the different weapons in your arsenal. In addition, the PlayStation 5 adaptive triggers and controller feedback for each gun is quite cool. For movement, the game really opens up once you gain the Phantom Dash, and the hover boots which let you quickly zoom around a level, and just like with the weapons, the adaptive triggers feel weighty here, especially as you're using them to charge up the hover boots to increase your speed.
Instruments for me.
Despite all it does right, however, it's really hard for me to not compare this game to the last big mainline entry to the series, A Crack in Time. I consider A Crack in Time to be the peak of the series, and there are two big reasons that I personally play a Ratchet and Clank game. They're the weapons, and then the characters and story. In my opinion, A Rift Apart is a step backwards in both of these areas compared to A Crack in Time. Now, it is very possible that nostalgia is playing a factor in this comparison, but I hope you can hear me out. For the remainder of this video, I would like to focus on these areas in more detail. I will also be making passing points of comparison to A Crack in Time. I'm going to start off with what the Ratchet and Clank series is probably known for more than anything else, and that's giving the player access to outlandish and wacky weaponry to utilize during combat. I've always been impressed with the creativity that goes into each game's arsenal of weapons, and honestly, I always look forward to seeing a shop during these games because you can't help but get excited about what new types of guns are going to be for sale. And while that excitement was still present during my initial playthrough of Rift Apart, by the end of the game, I can't say it was rewarded other than a handful of times. The weapons in Rift Apart are okay. but in my opinion, they don't live up to the creativity of previous games. There are 2 or 3 standout weapons in the game, such as the Topiary Sprinkler, which is a sprinkler head you throw out that will freeze enemies in place by turning them into a head shrub. Another great example is the Ricochet, which is a gun that fires a shot at an enemy, and then you can continue to pull the trigger to keep the shot bouncing on the enemy and continuing to do damage. These weapons are both creative and really cool additions to the arsenal. However, outside of these couple interesting new additions, it seems like the developers mostly played it safe, with the classic pistol, the bomb glove, a shotgun, rocket launcher, etc. Again, this isn't at its core a large negative. The game's guns are still cool to look at and fun to use. However, to make my point more clear, this is the 4th game that we've gotten the Buzzblade launcher, and it's remained virtually unchanged. The Warmonger rocket launcher is virtually unchanged from its 2 previous games. The Headhunter sniper rifle functions identically to the Plasma Striker from the previous games, down to being able to see weak points on enemies. These are all fun guns for sure, but it's not like these guns are important to the story or are series staples like the Rhino. Another example is Mr. Fungi, which is a fun and new weapon, but functions identically to how the Mr. Zircon weapon did in the previous games. And I get that Mr. Zircon now plays a role in the story, but my point is, why just give us the same weapon dressed up different? This could have been a chance to give us a new spin on the Minion style of weapon, especially given that the game also gives us 2 other Minion style weapons, in the form of Agents of Doom, which release a swarm of mechanical creatures on the ground that attack enemies, and the Bombardier, which is a flying drone that fires a bomb at enemies every couple of seconds. Both, for reference, I also consider more or less fine, but a little bland. When I think of weapons from the Ratchet & Clank series, my mind immediately goes to the Groovatron, a grenade that made enemies dance, and that the developers took the time to give each enemy type their own unique dance. Or the Winterizer, which turned enemies into snowmen while playing Christmas music. Or the Magnet Launcher, a gun which fired an electrically charged net that would trap a single enemy. Or Mr. Zircon himself, who would shoot at enemies while shit-talking them. These guns were fun to use and useful, but also had something that I think almost none of the weapons in Rift Apart have, which is character. Now, I don't want to be the classic YouTuber who bashes on something and then offers no solutions. So I want to circle back to Mr. Fungi and give an example of what I think could have been a better version of this weapon. Now keep in mind, I am not a game developer, and to be honest, I'm really just kind of shooting from the hip here. Off the top of my head, what if instead of just releasing a flying mushroom guy who just shoots at enemies, again functionally identical to the Mr. Zircon weapon from previous games, minus the charm, what if when using this weapon, he instead threw out spores at enemies, and that turned those enemies that were impacted by it into allies? See, I literally came up with this idea after just briefly thinking about fungus, maybe the Last of Us, and the cordyceps fungus. You could have upgrades that make him throw out more spores, or maybe erupt into spores when he dies, etc. For enemies that were being controlled, you could animate a little Last of Us cordyceps fungus on the top of their heads, or not. Just give them a little fucking plant sprout coming out of their head. The point is, I came up with this idea in about 5 minutes as a way to not just be a carbon copy of a previous weapon, and instead it's a new concept, turning enemies against their own. Another idea that I don't believe has ever been done in a Ratchet & Clank game is why not make an old-fashioned 6-shooter revolver? You could have some sort of active reload on it, or maybe it has like a Deadeye type mechanic where it lets you slow down time and paint a target or multiple targets with 6 markers, and then you could rapidly fire all the shots in the gun at once. Again, I'm just throwing out basic ideas for weapons without really giving this too much thought. I'm not being paid to do this. Now, I want to clarify. I mentioned earlier that the combat felt good, and it does. Despite that though, I can still think that the weapons are a bit bland and uninspiring. Hell, even the presentation about the guns feels less interesting. In A Crack in Time, each weapon had its own unique cartoon video that explained how the gun worked. Again, these were just animated and shown when you clicked a button in the weapon shop. Here's the one for the Buzzblade weapon.
Buzzblades are perfect for taking out hordes of enemies. Just hold down the trigger to fire the blades, and watch as they ricochet off everything they come into contact with. Before you know it, you'll be the last Lombax standing. Buzzblades, available only at GrumbleNet.
Now here's the same weapon intro video in Rift Apart.
Projectiles bouncing around the environment. Deal swift, piercing justice again and again and again!
I hope I'm not the only one that sees a difference in these two videos. The one from A Crack in Time seems like an actual advertisement in the game universe, whereas Rift Apart seems like it's trying to make small children playing this game laugh, which maybe it did. I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is that it seems like the creativity that once went into crafting each game's arsenals into these wild and character-filled weapons is just absent, or at least doesn't seem to be a priority anymore, which is a shame because it's always been one of my favorite parts of playing a new Ratchet and Clank game. Now, we're going to talk about the story, but I want to give a warning. There's going to be spoilers for Rift Apart, as well as A Crack in Time. The best way, I think, for me to introduce this section is to show you a brief clip from the opening hour of the game.
The dimensions are weakening considerably. Certainly not good. Great. Where are we?
When this game was first introduced, it was sold as introducing seamless travel between different dimensions. It sold the idea of a new Ratchet and Clank adventure that involved hopping through different dimensions. In fact, I want to read a quote from the game's Wikipedia page. I quote, "The game introduces to the series the concept of real-time near instantaneous travel between different areas, planets, and other worlds within gameplay scenes via a system of interdimensional portals. In order for the player to utilize this feature, a new mechanic dubbed the Rift Tether is introduced in Ratchet and Rivet's arsenal that pulls them from one side of a portal to another, allowing them to move quickly between points. The game features the return of planets explored in previous entries, now with a dimensional twist through their alternate counterparts, alongside new planets not seen previously in the franchise." The problem is that this video and this quote are largely lies, or at the very least, intentionally misleading. There are no, let me repeat, no moments like what you just watched that are meaningfully playable. Every moment that involves travel through different areas, planets, or other worlds, even half as rapidly as you're seeing, is either on rails or just flat out a cutscene. There are 2 levels in the game where you can swap between 2 versions of the same planet, and those are some of the best levels in the entire game. I will discuss one of those levels in more detail later in this section. That being said, the whole traveling through rifts angle that is being pitched doesn't actually exist in the way that they're describing. The new gameplay mechanic, known as the Rift Tether, is a glorified grappling hook that you use to reach new or hidden areas. Watch.
Did you see that?
That was rather exciting.
Ride the train to Countyville!
Additionally, the dimensional twist on familiar planets is almost non-existent, again in a meaningful way. I'll discuss this towards the end of this video. Before going any further, I want to say that I found the story of Rift Apart passable at best. Both of the new main characters, Rivet and Kit, are mostly fine, and I actually hope that they both stick around for future games. I'd even be surprised if we don't get a smaller Miles Morales-sized game featuring adventures of Rivet and Kit. The addition of these two characters isn't the problem with the game's story. Basically everything else is. Rift Apart's story problem is that there is almost no substance or character work occurring. As I just mentioned, both of the new main characters are fine. However, both Ratchet and Clank themselves are dumbed down. They both are less snarky and more naive than they were in their PS2 and PS3 era of games. I understand that Sony is now trying to market the Ratchet and Clank series to kids. But I was a kid when I played the original PS2 versions. And the sassy, intelligent, and funny personalities are what made me like the characters. Now both Ratchet and Clank feel hollow, smoothed out so they don't have any rough edges, and just feel generic with no personalities. Even their friendship, which is one of the core pillars of the series, doesn't really feel believable anymore. Here, watch this short scene.
Ratchet, can you hear me? Ratchet, can you hear me?
Clank, are you okay? Where are you? I saw that Lombax take you in.
I am fine. In fact, I am with the Lombax now.
Hey, I'm Rivet.
What? Hi. Wow, this is...
Oh, wait, okay. I have to tell you something. Dr. Nefarious just crowned himself Emperor of this dimension.
I guess we better get started then. I'm glad you're okay, buddy.
You too, Ratchet.
Be careful out there.
Wow, another Lombax.
Let's build this thing.
If the stilted conversation wasn't enough, it just seems forced and, again, hollow. Clank then spends large chunks of the game feeling guilty and down on himself, but the problem is that this isn't Clank's personality, or at least it wasn't in previous games. Clank has made mistakes, but he doesn't wallow in self-pity. He motivates himself to fix the situation. On the other hand, Ratchet has turned into just the most generic, kind person with no thoughts of his own or actions that aren't sanitized to be good. And don't even get me started on Dr. Nefarious, a longtime villain of the series. He always had a screw loose, but in Rift Apart, he becomes a shadow of his former self, more bumbling idiot than he ever was. Dr. Nefarious used to be kind of a badass. Here's a comparison of Dr. Nefarious from A Rift Apart.
You think a crushing defeat is all it takes to stop me?
I mean, yes?
Well, think again! We're going to a dimension where I always win, so you can finally know how it feels.
And here from A Crack in Time.
My arch nemesis.
Not so smart now, are you?
Sir, the Zoni are inquiring about our progress.
How much longer must we pretend to be friends with those twits?
Sire does not remember. You must fix.
Yes, I'm fixing.
Stand by for sisterboard scan.
As you can probably tell, there's a different vibe that he's giving off in each game. This decision was almost assuredly made to have a more stark contrast between him and his alternate dimension version, Emperor Nefarious, who admittedly is actually quite a fun character, but not at the cost of the personality of the series staple, Dr. Nefarious.
Oh, who needs tradition? Let's spice things up.
Rift Apart is full of characters and scenes that could be incredibly impactful if handled right, and they obviously know how to do that because A Crack in Time is also full of those moments, but they're capitalized on. In that game, you spend almost the entire game watching the relationship between Ratchet and a fellow Lombax named Azimuth grow authentically with only hints of Azimuth's inner obsession for his own desires, and eventually he ultimately turns on Ratchet, culminating in him being the final boss. Or at the very end of that game, Clank decides to give up being the guardian of the Great Clock, basically the guardian of time itself, because he realizes that he can't abandon Ratchet. Because of this, it leads me to believe that the writers just chose not to invest as much in the narrative of A Rift Apart, potentially because of the new younger target audience for the series. I've seen comparisons online that Rift Apart is like a Pixar movie, and I can't for the life of me figure out how anybody who played this game in its entirety could make that comparison in any way other than the graphics. Saying that the story presented in Rift Apart is comparable in any way to movies like Soul or Inside Out or Coco is absolutely wrong. Those movies tackle big issues in subtle ways, utilize subtle comedy, and have thoughtful ideas. Rift Apart attempts to do none of that. What is truly frustrating is that Rift Apart had the potential to have an amazing story. The idea of alternate dimensions would have allowed them the perfect opportunity to examine their own series and characters through a different lens and craft character development, commentary, and humor based around their own worlds and their own universe. Now, I want to offer a suggestion of what the game could have been instead of only shitting on the game. I want to reiterate that I'm not a writer or a video game designer. These are just basic broad strokes of ideas that I had while writing the script for this video. I also understand that many of the suggestions I make would have required the game to be longer, which would have required more work to be done on cutscenes and making new planets, etc. However, I also want to say that I find it disappointing the story that we got. So if it required an extra year of development time, that's personally something I would have been okay with.
What's it? Hey.
Hey! Yes, hi. I have Clank.
Oh, pal.
I am fine, Ratchet. In fact, I am beginning to like my new look.
For the record, I found him like this.
Come on, I knew you wouldn't hurt Clank. Pretty sure you're me, after all.
Wait, what makes you so sure you're not me?
Well, I mean, come on,
You got nothing.
Yeah, I got nothing.
Now, imagine a game where, for example, Ratchet and Rivet were actual reflections of each other, instead of basically the same character. Rivet is a lone wolf and grew up both as the only Lombax and without a companion like Clank. This made her more hardened, and when she meets Ratchet and Clank, she could have been dismissive of them, but also a little jealous. She could use her injury as a reminder to never rely on others, and that you can only trust yourself. Rivet could have been this absolute badass who has known the galaxy over. Her character arc throughout the game could have been her realizing that, despite her best efforts, she can't defeat Emperor Nefarious on her own, and that it's okay to ask for help. Ratchet's arc, on the other hand, could be one of change, but also self-acknowledgement. He's nervous about the real possibility of meeting his family and the rest of the Lombaxes, and doesn't feel like he will measure up to them. With the addition of meeting Rivet, who he sees maybe as a better version of himself, his story could be him coming to terms with his own fear of stepping outside of his comfort zone, something that the different dimensions versions of what he's familiar with could have amplified. This could have culminated in him actually, maybe even just briefly, having to locate and go to the dimension where the Lombaxes are. Or maybe Emperor Nefarious goes there in the final showdown of the game as the first dimension he's going to start taking over or destroying. After defeating Emperor Nefarious, this could have ended with the heroes having to leave that dimension or get trapped. Ratchet could have had some sort of brief introduction with his family and be forced to make the decision of whether to stay or leave. And listen, I get that Ratchet actually searching for and meeting his family is something that they probably want to build a whole game around. The scene right before the end credits implies that this is where the main characters are going to be going in the next game. I get that. But this plot thread has been hanging around for 15 years. The developers need to do something with it or move on from it already. Now, the game actually already sets up the foundation of these arcs that I just described. However, neither really are seen through to the emotional conclusion, or the character development just seems super rushed. For example, in the game, Rivet is a lone wolf. However, she almost immediately accepts Clank with very little hesitation, and then eventually the same with Kit, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Ratchet, throughout the game, expresses his hesitation to find his family and not wanting to change the good place that he's at right now. That isn't ever really expanded on until the last 20 seconds of the game, where he says, hey, let's go find them. Hell, even Dr. Nefarious could have gotten an arc of actual reflection. They could have brought back Dr. Nefarious's butler, Lawrence, who has been a series staple, serving as kind of a perfect foil to Nefarious's off-the-wall personality. This, for one, probably would have helped Dr. Nefarious's character. They could have both journeyed through the rifts and began working with Emperor Nefarious, maybe have a scene of Emperor Nefarious explaining how he ended up winning, and that it starts by removing attachments or something like that. And then he shoots and kills Lawrence. This could actually be a big moment for us to see our Nefarious's reaction and his own reflection on who he is and his desires. This would have also been a better setup for his eventual turning on Emperor Nefarious, which he does at the end, and joining our heroes. Finally, this could have been a great way to change up the character of Dr. Nefarious for future games, or maybe he actually works with the heroes instead of just continuing over and over to be the villain. There are a few narrative moments that you can see flashes of the old games. We'll talk about one of them here pretty soon. But by and large, the game's writers, and by extension, the narrative, seem so scared of taking chances or pushing into direction of actual reflection or offering conflicts among heroes that aren't immediately resolved. And instead, all it does is offer generic heroes fighting the bad guys. Nothing deeper, no substance. Again, in a game about alternate dimensions and different reflections of the characters we've known for so long, there's almost no actual reflecting going on in the narrative. Now I want to shift gears from the characters to the worlds that get visited in Rift Apart, because they make up the backdrop and set up the narrative beats. I'm going to begin with the good and examine two of the worlds. They both are good for different reasons, but show off what the levels and, by extension, the story could have been. First, I want to look at one of the final worlds you visit, a planet called Visceron, with the focus of the planet being on the Zordoom prison. You are playing as Rivet, alone as she tries to rescue the other characters from the prison. This level, first off, is very visually well done. The ocean and the rain and the red lights and tint just everywhere. Looks great. You work your way through the prison until eventually you find Clank and the rest of the resistance, minus Ratchet and Kit. You release them all, and you get a good moment between Rivet and the other characters. This scene fits so perfectly into the obvious Rivet story arc that I mentioned earlier. You see Phantom ask if she needs backup. She says no, but then takes a moment to tell him thanks. The following interactions afterwards show that she has started to care about Clank. As they continue further into the prison, Rivet opens up to Clank about her current feelings about Kit, that Kit is the warbot who took Rivet's arm. Clank asks if Rivet could ever forgive Kit, and all of this leads to this scene at the end of the level.
Give us a minute.
We'll meet you at the ship.
Clank told me I should try to forgive you. I am going back to Zavali. I never should have. Wait! You're just gonna hide again? Now?
I am very... Truly, I am sorry, Rivet. For everything. I am not a good partner.
Well, maybe you could be. If you'd stopped to help me that night instead of running away, things could have been different. Or if you just told the truth, maybe...
Why do none of you understand? I am broken. I will always be broken.
Fine. Go hide. We have a universe to save. Yeah, universes, whatever. I don't need a partner anyway.
This is a very well done scene. These are two characters that are both broken, and through this scene and the build-up done in this level, we see that. This feels like the actual beginning of their real relationship and the build-up to them becoming partners. The problem? It's followed literally 20 minutes later by this scene. I know I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but the developers just seem so scared to let any conflicts sit for too long or show us any form of reflection from the characters. Why not have the prison scene occur earlier in the game, or have a few more levels after it where Rivet is alone, or has Clank with her and showing her reflecting on her conversation with Kit? Or why not have a level where Ratchet goes and finds Kit to talk to her? These two scenes have nothing that happens between them. So one moment they are angry at each other, and the next moment they are back to being friends. Now, the second level I want to look at is Kidaro Station. This world becomes available about halfway through the story, and it features Ratchet and Kit trying to forge their own Dimensionator device. There are two things that make this level great, and the first is something called Blizon crystals. These crystals, when struck, transport the player to a different dimensions version of the current planet. This idea is beautiful and creates such fun puzzles, situations where you have to move between alternate dimensions in order to accomplish your goals. In this particular level, you are swapping between a version of the station that is currently in operation and run by Emperor Nefarious's troops, and a version of the station that is abandoned but has a giant indestructible monster running around and chasing you. This scenario is the second reason this level is great. It's so unique, and it feels like it actually has the charm from the older games in it. This level, in my opinion, is the best level in the game. However, despite being a great level, it creates some overall problems for the rest of the planets. The system involving these Blizon crystals is only used for 2 of the 8 explorable planets, which may seem fine, because it obviously takes a lot of work to create 2 variants of the same space for players to swap between. However, dimension hopping is the main thing they sold this game on. Due to this, this mechanic should have been in every single world, or at least the majority of them. Furthermore, if they were going to only do it for a handful of the planets, it's my opinion that they should have prioritized the planets returning from previous games. Make those planets the ones that showcase the dimension hopping, because they are the ones that are familiar to returning fans. I want to again reference part of that quote that I used at the beginning of this story section. I quote, "The game features the return of planets explored in previous entries with a dimensional twist through their alternate counterparts. The game mainly takes place in Rivet and Kit's dimension, with only the intro and ending sections taking place in Ratchet and Clank's dimension. With that, there are 4 locations that are revisits in this game. You have Sargasso, the swampy area, you have Tauren 4, the desert junk planet, you have Ardolis, the pirate haven, and technically Zordoom, that prison. None of these locations really get a meaningful dimensional twist and are all basically the same location from their respective games. But I just don't understand why you would advertise the return of planets with a dimensional twist, but then not do anything with it. Now, I'm going to use the Pirate Haven planet, Ardolis, as an example. I want to start by saying that this planet is actually one of my favorites in the game, and just environmentally is very charming and funny, especially the section with the pirate trials. However, it is more or less the same planet that you visit in the PS3 game, Tools of Destruction. Now, wouldn't the point of including this planet again, and an alternate dimension version of it, be so that you could flip it on its head? Really pump the gas, do something wacky with it, or something really funny. And as you fly to the planet, they go so far as to show you that the planet has been partially destroyed by Emperor Nefarious. Well, why not expand on this to show how different Rivet's dimension is? Maybe when Emperor Nefarious attempted to destroy the planet, it caused the region to become a barren desert wasteland. This could lead to wacky changes in Rivet's universe where, instead of space pirates, they are actually now space cowboys or outlaws. It's conceptually the same thing and would lead to the same plot beats, but adds character and is just a funny concept in and of itself. Space cowboys in flying covered wagons or riding robotic horses. Instead of Rusty Pete or Pierre, you could have Dusty Pete, who is like a Clint Eastwood inspired badass. This alone would feel like enough because you could have Ratchet and Clank commenting on the differences from their version of the planet. And it would be a wink to fans of the series who actually know the planet from Tools of Destruction. Or even combine this with being one of the levels featuring the Blizon crystals, where you are swapping between the Pirate Haven and the Outlaw Desert. I'm not trying to say my ideas are perfect, but I'm merely trying to illustrate what could have been, and also to point out that Insomniac's very own advertisements and descriptions for this game seem to not be what is actually in the game. A Crack in Time took the idea of time travel and used it to tell a meaningful and well done story, as well as create levels that explored the use of time travel. My hope was that Rift Apart would do the same for alternate dimensions, and it does not. I just can't help but feel like the overall character of the Ratchet and Clank series is continuing to be sucked out of it. Everything in this game is safe and sterilized. From the weapons and the planets you visit, to the actual characters and the story. Where is the innovation? And where is the creativity? Where is the humor? Where are the characters? Because none seem to be a core part of this series' identity anymore, and that makes me really sad. Ratchet and Clank is a series that has always been important to me. I still love the series, and I probably always will. This is also why I feel disappointed by Rift Apart, because I can't help imagine what the game could have been as opposed to what we got.
Don't you think it's weird to throw a celebration for us? I mean, we haven't done anything heroic in years. What if everyone thinks we're washed up? Oh, what if we are washed up?
Luckily, we will not need to perform any heroics. Unless you count smiling and waving.
Right.